They told me the 404th Auxiliary was a desk job, supply chain logistics, safe. I signed the transfer papers because I was tired of eating shrapnel on the front lines of the Orion campaign. Nobody mentioned the 404th was exclusively an all-female alien shock troop battalion. Nobody mentioned their species literally bred for war, stood 7 feet tall, and viewed human men as dangerously fragile commodities. When I walked into that barracks, 80 pairs of glowing eyes snapped to me. I wasn't just the new mechanic. I was a shiny new toy. Mud sucked at my standard-issue boots like a starving animal. Heavy rain lashed against my visor, blurring the flickering neon signage of Forward Operating Base Delta. I clutched the transfer data pad tightly to my chest, shielding it from the acidic downpour. 2 years. 2 years I had spent tightening bolts on artillery shells while getting shelled myself by the local insurgency on this miserable rock. When Command finally approved my transfer to the 404th Logistics and Auxiliary, I thought I had won the lottery. Logistics meant inside work. It meant heating. It meant sleeping without one eye open, waiting for a mortar to collapse my tent. My neural implant pinged, overlaying a green navigational arrow across my vision. It pointed toward a massive, reinforced bunker at the edge of the perimeter. Sector 7. That was odd. Sector 7 was usually reserved for the heavy infantry, the Coalition's allied alien forces who needed reinforced flooring and specialized atmospheric scrubbers. I paused, wiping grime from my faceplate. My joints ached with the deep, throbbing pain of chronic fatigue. I didn't care if the 404th shared a wall with a nuclear reactor, as long as they had a cot with my name on it. I punched the access code into the keypad outside the bunker. The heavy steel doors hissed, unlocking with a deep mechanical groan, and slid apart, heat washed over me. It wasn't the stale, recycled air of a typical human barracks. This air was thick, humid, and smelled intensely of ozone, heavy machine oil, and something distinctly feral, like rain on hot stones. I stepped inside, the heavy doors thudding shut behind me, cutting off the howl of the storm. I unlatched my helmet, letting it drop to my side, and blinked against the harsh, industrial lighting. 80 conversations stopped at once. I froze. The room was massive, lined with bunks that looked more like reinforced steel cages. Weapons were field-stripped on massive iron tables, plasma casters the size of my torso, kinetic hammers that would snap a human's spine just from the recoil. But it wasn't the weapons that made my blood run cold. It was the soldiers holding them. Kailari. I had seen them on the holovids, and maybe once or twice from a distance across a staging ground. But being in a sealed room with a full company of them was entirely different. They averaged 7 feet in height. Their skin was a muted, slate gray, patterned with subtle, darker striations that shifted when their heavy muscles flexed. They wore minimalist combat fatigues that did nothing to hide physiques built for high-gravity warfare. 4-fingered hands, tipped with blunt, practical claws, rested on weapons or paused in midair, and every single one of them was staring at me. My implant, calibrated to translate their complex vocalizations and pheromone markers into standard human cultural equivalents, began rapidly tagging the individuals in my field of view. Western names hovered over their heads in crisp blue text, a psychological comfort feature designed by coalition shrinks to make giant alien shock troops seem less terrifying to human grunts. It wasn't working. A soldier near the closest table, tagged as Roxy by my HUD, slowly lowered the massive bolt carrier group she was cleaning. Her eyes, a stark, luminous amber locked onto me. She had a jagged scar running down the left side of her jaw. She didn't blink. None of them blinked. I managed, my voice cracking slightly. I cleared my throat, forcing my spine straight. I was a coalition soldier. I had survived the trench fighting at Outpost Charlie. I wasn't going to let a room full of heavy infantry intimidate me. I'm looking for the 404th Auxiliary, duty officer. A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. It took me a second to realize it was a collective murmur spreading through the barracks, a mixture of deep, chest-rattling clicks and low hums. From the back of the room, a figure stood up. She was taller than the rest, maybe pushing 7'3", with heavy pauldron armor still strapped to her shoulders. My HUD tagged her as Harper, displaying a rank insignia equivalent to a human major. She walked down the central aisle. The other soldiers parted seamlessly, stepping back with a rigid, immediate deference that sent a chill down my spine. Harper stopped 3 feet in front of me. Up close, the sheer mass of her was overwhelming. I had to crane my neck to look her in the eye. Her slate-gray skin was flawless, save for a few faded white combat scars across her collarbone. She looked down at me, her amber eyes scanning my muddy, exhausted frame. She looked at my scuffed armor, my grease-stained hands, and finally, my face. She tilted her head. The translator earpiece clicked, converting her deep, resonant growl into a harsh female voice. "You are in the wrong sector, human. This is a frontline assault barracks. My orders say 404th Logistics and Auxiliary," I said, holding up the datapad. My hand was shaking slightly. I clamped it down. "Caleb Miller, reassigned as Chief Mechanic and Quartermaster Auxiliary." Harper didn't take the datapad. She leaned in closer. The smell of ozone and sweat was overpowering. "The 404th is a Kalari unit. We are an all-female blood cadre. We do not have human mechanics, and we certainly do not take male non-combatants." I stared at her. The exhaustion in my bones temporarily vanished, replaced by a cold spike of panic. I looked past her, glancing at the 80 massive, heavily armed women watching my every move. The silence was absolute. "Clerical error," I muttered, looking back at the datapad. "Command must have screwed up the unit designation. I'll just head back to the admin tent and get it sorted out." I took a step backward, reaching for the door panel. A heavy gray hand clamped onto my shoulder. It felt like a vice grip made of warm iron. I stopped dead. "No," Harper said, her voice dropping an octave. "The storm is a Category 4 hazard. Administration is locked down until morning. You are not leaving." Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Harper's grip on my shoulder didn't tighten, but the implication was clear. I was rooted to this spot until she decided otherwise. I looked up into her amber eyes, trying to find a trace of malice, but there was only a fierce, predatory curiosity. "I can sleep in the corridor," I suggested, my voice betraying a hint of desperation. "I've slept in worse. Really, it's fine." Harper released my shoulder and crossed her arms over her chest. The metal plates of her armor clanked against each other. "Our corridors are unheated. The ambient temperature will drop below your species' survival threshold in 2 hours. You will remain in the barracks." She turned her head slightly, projecting her voice to the rest of the room. "Roxy, clear a bottom rack." The soldier with the scarred jaw, Roxy, nodded sharply. She moved to a bunk near the center of the room, effortlessly lifting a heavy duffel bag that would have taken 2 human men to carry, and tossed it onto a top rack. She patted the thin, rigid mattress of the bottom bunk and looked at me. Her lips parted slightly, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp for comfort. "Come on, little human," Roxy called out, the translator rendering her tone as a rough, mocking purr. "It won't bite." A low ripple of laughter spread through the barracks. It sounded like a collection of diesel engines idling. I swallowed hard, clutching my helmet, and walked down the aisle. Every step felt like walking through deep water. I could feel their eyes on me. The Kalari didn't stare like humans did. They didn't glance away when you caught them looking. They tracked my movements with the intense focus of apex predators watching a wounded herbivore stumble into their den. I reached the bunk. It was wide enough for 2 of me, and the mattress felt like solid concrete. I set my helmet down and unbuckled my utility harness, letting it drop to the floor with a metallic clatter. I kept my sidearm holstered on my thigh. It was a stupid instinctual comfort. A standard plasma pistol wouldn't even dent a Kalari's dermal layer, let alone stop an angry one. But having the weight against my leg made me feel marginally less naked. I sat on the edge of the bunk. Roxy leaned against the steel support frame, crossing her massive arms. She was uncomfortably close. "Caleb," she said, testing the syllables of my name. A soft sound. "You look fragile, Caleb. How did you survive the trenches?" "I kept my head down," I answered honestly, staring straight ahead. "And I fixed the guns that kept the insurgency from overrunning the wire." A soldier from the adjacent bunk leaned over. My HUD tagged her as Quinn. She was slightly leaner than Roxy, with intricate dark blue tattoos spiraling up her neck. "You fixed the heavy weapons? Human hands are so small." She reached out, her thick fingers hovering inches from my face. I flinched, leaning back. Quinn laughed, a deep, resonant sound. "Nervous. Males of our species do not go to war. They remain on the home world. They weave, they study, they raise the young. They break if you handle them too roughly." "I don't weave," I said, a spark of defensive anger cutting through my fear. "And I don't break that easily." Harper materialized at the end of the aisle. The casual chatter instantly died. "Enough. The human needs rest. We deploy at 0600. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "You will sleep. Tomorrow, I will drag you to administration myself and fix this error. Until then, you are under my protection. If any of my cadre touch you inappropriately, you tell me. Do you understand?" "Understood, Major," I said, using her translated rank. She offered a slow, deliberate nod, then turned and walked toward her private quarters at the back of the bunker. The heavy steel door slid shut behind her. The lights in the main barracks abruptly dimmed, switching from harsh white to a low, tactical red. The sudden shift in lighting cast long, demonic shadows across the walls. The Kailari began settling into their bunks. The sound of heavy armor being unlatched and dropped to the floor echoed off the concrete walls. I swung my legs up onto the rigid mattress and lay back. I didn't bother taking off my boots. I crossed my arms over my chest and stared up at the metal springs of the bunk above me. My heart was still hammering against my ribs. "Hey, Caleb!" The voice came from the bunk above me. It was Roxy. "Yeah?" I whispered back. "You really fixed the heavy plasma casters?" "Yes." A pause. "Then The mattress above me groaned as she shifted her massive weight. My primary cannon has been overheating after 4 cycles. The local armorers couldn't find the fault. It's the coolant injection valve, I said, the mechanical knowledge flowing out of me automatically. It was safe ground, something I understood. The sand on this planet gets past the primary filters. It scores the valve lining. You need to strip it, flush it with solvent, and replace the O-rings with the high-temp variants. Standard issue melts. Silence hung in the red-lit air for a long moment. High-temp variants, Roxy repeated softly. Tomorrow, before Harper drags you to administration, you will fix it for me. It wasn't a request. Sure, I said to the ceiling. I'll fix it. I closed my eyes, listening to the deep, rhythmic breathing of 80 alien giants. I was a human male, trapped in a cage with a blood cadre of matriarchal warriors who viewed me as a fragile oddity. I had a terrible sinking feeling that Command's clerical error was going to be a lot harder to undo than just asking for a new piece of paper. Morning arrived not with a gentle sunrise, but with the ear-splitting shriek of a klaxon alarm. My eyes snapped open. I was instantly awake, heart pounding, hand instinctively dropping to the empty holster on my thigh before I remembered I'd taken it off. Red tactical lighting flipped to blinding, fluorescent white. Around me, the bunker came alive. The Kylari didn't wake up groggy. They simply transitioned from a state of rest to a state of absolute readiness in seconds. Heavy boots hit the concrete floor. Armor plates clattered. The smell of ozone and morning rations, some kind of high-protein, meat-based paste, filled the damp air. I sat up, my spine cracking in 3 places. The concrete mattress had done me no favors. Before I could even rub the sleep from my eyes, a massive shadow fell over my bunk. Roxy stood there. She was already half-armored, the dark gray plating bolted to her fatigue jacket. In her hands, she held the primary assembly of a Mark IV heavy plasma caster. The weapon was a beast. Fully assembled, it weighed nearly 90 pounds. She held the core block with one hand like it was a toy. "You promised," she said. The translator rendered her voice flat, expectant. I blinked, my brain slowly catching up to the situation. Right, the coolant valve. "Give me 5 minutes. "I deploy in 40, she countered. "Then you'd better put it on the table and find me some solvent," I muttered, sliding out of the bunk. I didn't care that she was 7 feet of alien muscle. A broken gun was a broken gun, and mechanics had their own chain of command. She grunted, a low clicking sound echoing in her throat, but she turned and laid the weapon on the nearby iron workbench. I grabbed my utility belt and walked over. The Kylari women in the immediate vicinity stopped their morning prep to watch. I ignored them. I unspooled my tool roll, pulled out a magnetic driver, and got to work. The Mark IV was a standard Coalition heavy weapon, but it was designed for Kylari hands. The access ports were wide, the retaining pins thick. I popped the primary housing open. The smell of burnt carbon and fried electronics hit my nose. I dug my fingers into the receiver, maneuvering past the heavy heat sinks. "See this?" I asked, pointing a grease-stained finger into the guts of the gun. Roxy leaned over my shoulder. Her proximity was suffocating, radiating heat like a furnace. "Your local armorers didn't clean the primary baffle. The sand scored the seal." I pulled out a pair of needle-nose pliers. This was where human physiology had the advantage. My hands were small enough to bypass the secondary housing entirely. I reached deep into the narrow chamber, clamped onto the ruined O-ring, and twisted. It popped out, a melted ring of useless black rubber. I tossed it onto the table. Got any high-temp seals in the armory? Roxy reached into a pouch on her tactical rig and tossed a small plastic case onto the table. I snapped it open, found the blue-rimmed silicone ring, and carefully seated it into the valve assembly. I tightened down the injection port, wiped away the excess carbon with a rag, and slammed the housing shut. Done, I said, wiping my hands on my pants. It won't overheat, but you need to stop dragging the muzzle through the dirt when you vault trenches. A murmur rippled through the gathered soldiers. Roxy picked up the heavy weapon. She racked the charging handle. The satisfying heavy clack of metal seating perfectly into place echoed in the room. A green indicator light blinked to life on the side of the casing. She looked at the weapon, then down at me. Her amber eyes narrowed. Human mechanics are efficient. You will survive. Before I could ask what she meant by that, a booming voice cut through the noise. Miller, gear up. Harper strode down the aisle. Her armor was fully assembled, scarred and battered from countless drops. She held a data pad in one hand. We are going to administration. I want you out of my barracks before my cadre gets too accustomed to having a pet. I didn't argue. I grabbed my helmet, buckled my combat harness, and followed her out the door. The storm had passed, leaving Fob Delta drowning in a sea of thick yellow mud. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with toxic clouds. I walked a pace behind Harper. I had to jog every few steps just to match her long, punishing stride. Coalition grunts, humans mostly, stopped and stared as we passed. A human trailing behind a Cavalry major like a lost puppy was not a common sight. We reached the administration bunker. It was a sterile, heavily fortified dome near the center of the base. Inside, it smelled of stale coffee and burnt ozone. A human clerk sat behind thick plexiglass. My HUD tagged him as Jenkins. He looked exhausted, bags under his eyes deep enough to carry ammo. Major Harper, Jenkins said, his voice crackling through the intercom. He didn't look intimidated. Clerks never were. They possessed the ultimate power. Bureaucratic apathy. What can I do for the 404th? You assigned a human male to my blood cadre, Harper said. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. Her voice rattled the plexiglass. Fix it. Reassign him. Jenkins sighed. He tapped away at a holographic keyboard. Name and serial? Caleb Miller, 884-2199, I said, stepping up beside Harper. I'm supposed to be logistics and auxiliary, standard supply depot. Jenkins kept typing. A minute passed, then 2. He frowned, leaning closer to his screen. Miller, yeah, I see it here. Transfer approved by Sector Command, assigned to 404th Auxiliary. The 404th does not have a human auxiliary, Harper stated coldly. They do now, Jenkins replied, not looking up. Command restructured the support doctrines last week. They're attaching embedded mechanics to heavy infantry squads to reduce equipment downtime. You guys break a lot of guns, Major. Command got tired of paying for replacements. This is unacceptable, Harper growled. She slammed a heavy gray fist against the counter. The metal buckled slightly. He will die on the first drop. Take it up with Sector Command, Jenkins said, completely unfazed by the dented steel. I can submit an appeal. It'll take 6 to 8 weeks to process. Until then, he's your mechanic. I stared at Jenkins. My stomach dropped into my boots. 6 to 8 weeks. I wouldn't last 6 days in a frontline assault unit. Cancel the transfer, I pleaded. Send me back to Outpost Charlie. Please. Jenkins looked at me with dead eyes. System locked it, Miller. You belong to the 404th now. Next in line. Harper didn't say a word on the walk back to Sector 7. Her silence was heavier than the gravity on this miserable rock. I trudged behind her, my mind spinning. 6 weeks. The life expectancy of a frontline mechanic in a heavy infantry unit was measured in hours, not weeks. When we entered the barracks, the atmosphere had shifted. The women of the 404th were fully geared. The chaotic noise of the morning had been replaced by a low, intense hum of focused aggression. They were checking ammo loads, calibrating HUDs, and applying dark, oily war paint to their slate-gray skin. Harper stopped at the head of the center aisle. She turned to me. "You are a liability," she said bluntly. Her translator clipped the words, making them sound sharp as glass. "My cadre fights in the vanguard. We breach the lines so the soft troops can follow. We do not babysit." "I don't need a babysitter," I lied. My hands were shaking. I balled them into fists to hide it. "I just need a workstation and broken gear. I can keep your weapons firing." Harper stared at me. Her amber eyes flicked to my hands, then to my face. "Roxy told me what you did with her plasma caster. She said your small hands are useful." "I'm a certified master technician," I said, clinging to the only leverage I had. "I know Kalari tech. I know coalition tech. If I stay in the rear with the supply tread, I won't get in your way." "The 404th has no rear," Harper replied. "We drop together. We fight together." She turned to face the room. "Listen to me," she roared. The guttural Kalari command cut through the bunker like a physical shockwave. 80 soldiers snapped to attention. "Command has chained this human to our cadre," Harper announced. She pointed a massive finger at me. "He is frail. He is slow. But he possesses mechanical utility. He is our embedded asset. You will treat him as such. If he falls behind, you leave him. If he breaks, we discard him. But while he breathes, he maintains the armory." She looked at Roxy. "Roxy, he is your shadow. Keep him alive long enough to fix the secondary thermal scopes on Squad 3's rifles." Roxy grinned. It was a terrifying expression. "Understood, Major. Come here, little mechanic." I walked over to her bunk. My legs felt like lead. Roxy grabbed me by the shoulder webbing of my harness and practically lifted me off the ground, hauling me toward the back of the bunker where the spare parts were caged. "We drop in 20 minutes, Roxy said, shoving a crate of thermal optics into my chest. It weighed a ton. I staggered back, but kept my grip. Squad 3's scopes are misaligned. They cannot target effectively through the smoke. Fix them." I didn't argue. I didn't have time to panic. The mechanical instinct took over. I dropped the crate onto a workbench and ripped it open. The smell of gun oil and ozone grounded me. I pulled out my diagnostic scanner and started stripping the optics. For 19 minutes, the world vanished. I didn't think about the 7-foot-tall alien warriors surrounding me. I didn't think about the bureaucratic nightmare that had condemned me. I just focused on the tiny, intricate servos inside the scopes, realigning the laser gyros with delicate precision. My hands moved in a blur. This was my war. "Time," Harper's voice boomed. I slammed the casing shut on the last optic and tossed it to a waiting soldier. My HUD tagged her as Quinn. She caught it effortlessly, snapping it onto her rifle rail. A green targeting laser lanced across the room, perfectly straight. Quinn looked at me, tapping her chest plate twice in a Kalari gesture of respect. Efficient. Suddenly, the base sirens shrieked. It wasn't the morning alarm. It was the frantic, oscillating wail of incoming fire. The ground shuddered violently. Dust rained from the concrete ceiling. A muffled explosion rattled my teeth, followed by 3 more in rapid succession. The insurgency wasn't waiting for us to drop. They were hitting FOB Delta. "Incoming artillery!" Harper bellowed, slapping her helmet over her head. "Breach protocols! The perimeter is compromised! 404th! Move out!" The barracks doors hissed open. The Kailari poured out into the muddy staging ground like a gray avalanche. I stood frozen at the workbench, my tools still in my hands. The reality of my situation finally smashed into me. I wasn't going to a supply depot. I was going to a firefight. A heavy hand grabbed the back of my collar. Roxy jerked me forward, nearly snapping my neck. "Move, human," she snarled, hauling me toward the door. "You are my shadow now. Do not fall behind." We hit the exterior mud just as a mortar shell impacted 50 yards away. The shockwave threw me off my feet, but Roxy didn't let go. She dragged me upright, her massive plasma caster already tracking targets through the toxic fog. Tracers lit up the bruised sky. The deafening roar of kinetic hammers and plasma fire drowned out the sirens. I scrambled for my sidearm, a pathetic gesture against the sheer volume of violence erupting around us. Roxy stepped in front of me, using her armored bulk to shield me from a spray of shrapnel that pinged off her plates like hail. "Stay low!" she roared, firing a blinding burst of blue plasma into the smoke. "And if my gun jams, you fix it." I hit the mud, clutching my tool roll like it was a lifeline. I was terrified. I was outmatched. But as I watched 80 Kalari women form a flawless, unbreakable wall of violence around my position, a strange, cynical thought crossed my mind. Sector Command had definitely screwed me. But if I had to be stuck in a war zone, at least I was stuck with the biggest, meanest monsters on the battlefield. I just had to make sure their guns didn't break. Dirt rained down in clods the size of my fist. The trench wall shook with the sheer kinetic force of the artillery barrage, tearing apart the staging ground behind us. I pressed my face into the mud, my hands clamped over my ears to stop my eardrums from rupturing. It didn't help much. The noise was a physical entity, a crushing weight that vibrated through my ribs and rattled my teeth in my skull. FOB Delta was burning. The local insurgents, a fanatic species of multi-limbed scavengers the coalition simply designated as Rippers, had managed to bypass the outer sensor grid. They were swarming the wire. I dared to peek over my forearms. Through the toxic yellow smoke, I saw the 404th holding the line. They didn't use cover like human infantry. They didn't duck. 80 Kalari women stood shoulder to shoulder in the knee-deep muck, forming a living wall of gray armor and pure, unadulterated violence. They fired in perfect synchronization. The blinding blue flashes of their heavy plasma casters strobed through the fog, illuminating the grotesque, scuttling shapes of the Rippers surging forward. Roxy was 5 feet to my left. She stood tall, bracing her Mark IV against her hip. Every time she pulled the trigger, a glob of superheated plasma vaporized whatever it touched. The recoil should have shattered a collarbone, but she barely swayed. She was laughing, a deep chest-rattling sound that somehow cut through the deafening roar of the firefight. Suddenly, a heavy projectile shrieked through the air and slammed into the barricade right in front of her. The explosion threw a shower of jagged ferro-concrete and shrapnel outward. Roxy stumbled back, her armor sparking as hot metal scraped across her chest plates. She didn't fall, but her plasma caster let out a horrific, grinding screech. The blue glow in the weapon's barrel flickered and died. She racked the charging handle. It wouldn't budge. She slammed her massive fist against the side of the casing. Nothing. "Mechanic!" she roared, dropping to one knee. She didn't look back at me. She kept her eyes forward, pulling a heavy combat blade from her thigh sheath as two rippers breached the wire and charged her position. I didn't think. If I thought about it, I would have stayed in the mud. Survival instinct told me to play dead, but mechanical instinct, and the cold realization that if Roxy died, I was next, dragged me to my feet. I scrambled through the muck, sliding into the cratered earth next to her. She lunged forward, catching the first ripper by its mandibles and driving her blade straight up into its thorax. Dark, acidic blood sprayed across her visor. The second ripper vaulted over its dead companion, claws extending. I grabbed the heavy plasma caster from where she had dropped it in the mud. It was agonizingly heavy. I hauled it onto my lap, my fingers slipping on blood and grime. "Cover me!" I screamed, my voice cracking. Roxy didn't answer with words. She ripped her blade free, kicked the dead alien off her boot, and threw herself between me and the incoming horde. She became a blender of gray armor and steel, hacking through carapace and bone to buy me seconds. I wiped the mud off the caster's receiver. The shrapnel from the explosion had dented the secondary housing, pinning the cooling fins directly against the magnetic rail assembly. The weapon's safety interlocks had triggered to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. It was a smart failsafe, but right now it meant we were going to die. I fumbled for my tool roll, ripping it open. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped my first pry bar into the puddle beneath me. I cursed, grabbing a heavy-duty magnetic driver. I jammed the flat head of the tool into the crevice between the dented armor plating and the cooling fins. "Hold on!" I yelled, though she couldn't hear me over the slaughter. I put all my weight onto the driver, leveraging my entire body against the stubborn alien metal. My shoulder screamed in protest. The metal groaned. I pushed harder, tasting copper in my mouth as I bit down on my lip. With a harsh snap, the dented housing popped outward. Hot steam hissed from the vents, scalding my knuckles. I ignored the burn. I reached in with my pliers, bypassed the bent retaining clip, and manually reset the magnetic rail alignment. The weapon shuddered in my lap. The green indicator light flared back to life, and a low, angry hum began to vibrate through the heavy chassis. I slapped the casing shut. "Roxy!" She was grappling with a massive ripper, holding its snapping jaws inches from her faceplate. I shoved the heavy plasma caster up toward her. She didn't even look. Her lower left hand snapped out, catching the weapon by the grip. In one fluid motion, she kicked the alien back, leveled the gun with one hand, and squeezed the trigger. A point-blank burst of blue plasma evaporated the Ripper's upper torso. The concussion wave knocked me flat onto my back. Roxy stood over me, panting heavily. The dark blood of the enemy smoked as it dripped from her gray armor. She looked down at the gun, then down at me, lying in the mud. The combat madness in her amber eyes receded just a fraction, replaced by something sharper, something like appraisal. She reached down, grabbed the tactical webbing on my chest, and hauled me back to my feet like a child. "Keep behind me, little mechanic," she growled. slamming a fresh thermal cell into her weapon. "You are proving expensive to replace." I grabbed my driver, spat a mouthful of gritty mud onto the ground, and nodded. I pressed my back against the concrete barrier, watching the Kylari line hold. They didn't take a single step backward, and for the next 3 hours, every time a gun jammed, a sight misaligned, or a kinetic hammer lost charge, a massive hand would drag me through the mud to fix it. I wasn't just surviving, I was keeping the monsters fed. Smoke clung to the ceiling of Sector 7 like a bruised sky. The base sirens had finally stopped, replaced by the hollow, exhausting silence that always follows a firefight. Outside, the rain had returned, washing the acidic blood and yellow mud off the concrete barricades. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with exhaustion. The Kylari were battered. Their armor was scorched, their slate-gray skin marred by shallow cuts and dark bruises that were already beginning to heal. They sat on their reinforced bunks, quiet, stripping off broken plates and tending to their gear. I was sitting on the floor near the rear workbench, my back against a steel pillar. I couldn't feel my legs. My hands were stained black with carbon and synthetic grease. I had lost a patch of skin on my left forearm to a plasma burn, and my head pounded with a relentless, rhythmic ache. I had spent the last 3 hours crawling through the mud, dragging my tool bag between 80 giant women under heavy fire. I pulled a dirty rag from my pocket and began wiping down my magnetic driver. I was too tired to sleep. My adrenaline was crashing, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell of nervous energy. Footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate. I looked up. Major Harper stood over me. Her armor was a mess. One of her pauldrons was entirely sheared off, and dried alien blood caked her left leg. She stared down at me, her face expressionless. "Miller," she said. I tried to stand up, my military training kicking in, but my knees refused to lock. I managed to get halfway up before sliding back down against the pillar. "Major." Harper didn't reprimand me. She reached onto her tactical belt, unclipped a metal canteen, and tossed it to me. I caught it clumsily. It was heavy, filled with cold, heavily mineralized water. "Drink," she ordered. I unscrewed the cap and took a long swig. It tasted like tin and sulfur, but it was the best thing I had ever swallowed. "We lost 0 personnel today," Harper stated, crossing her arms. The translator clipped her words, but there was a strange cadence beneath it, a shift in tone. 3 wounded, minor injuries. Squad 2 repelled a breach on the eastern wire because their kinetic drivers did not stall in the muck. "I greased the impact seals," I mumbled, wiping my mouth. "Told them to stop dragging the hammers in the dirt." Harper tilted her head. "Roxy reported that you repaired her primary weapon under direct enemy fire. She stated you removed an armor obstruction using manual leverage." "It was just a dented housing," I said, looking down at my burnt knuckles. "Basic field repair. No Kylari mechanic would attempt a manual bypass while the plasma core was primed. They would consider the risk of immolation too high." "They would fall back," Harper corrected. "You did not fall back." "I didn't have anywhere to go," I answered honestly. "If I ran, I'd get shot. If I didn't fix the gun, Roxy would get overrun, and then I'd get shot. Fixing the gun was the only option that didn't end with me dead." Harper stared at me for a long time. The harsh red tactical lighting caught the jagged scars on her neck. Finally, she gave a slow, deep nod. It wasn't a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement. "Rest, Caleb Miller," she said, using my full name for the first time. "You have earned your bunk." She turned and walked toward her private quarters. I let my head fall back against the pillar, closing my eyes. I just wanted 5 minutes of silence. 5 minutes where I didn't have to look at broken metal or alien giants. A heavy thud next to me made my eyes snap open. Roxy had dropped a massive battered kinetic hammer onto the workbench. She pulled up a steel stool and sat down, crowding my personal space. She smelled heavily of ozone and sweat. "The recoil dampener is misaligned," Roxy said, her amber eyes locking onto mine. She wasn't asking. I sighed, reaching for my tool roll. "Give me 10 minutes. Before I could even pop the primary latches on the hammer, another shadow fell over the bench. It was Quinn. She dropped 2 thermal scopes onto the metal table. "The lenses are cracked," Quinn said, her voice a low rumble. "We drop again tomorrow. I need them functional." Then came another soldier. My HUD tagged her as Chloe. She dropped a jammed sidearm on the pile. Then another Kalari approached. Then 2 more. I froze, my hands hovering over the tools. They all came toward me. A dozen massive, heavily armed Kalari warriors were forming a semicircle around my workbench. They weren't intimidating me. They weren't mocking me. The predatory mocking stares from yesterday were gone. They were replaced by an intense, overwhelming expectation. They looked at me the way human grunts looked at the medevac choppers. I wasn't just a fragile, misplaced human male anymore. I was their lifeline. I was the guy who kept their fangs sharp. "Wait," I said, holding up my hands as another soldier tried to drop a massive armor plate onto the overflowing bench. "Line up, one at a time. I only have 2 hands." The Kalari stopped. They looked at each other. Then, slowly, they formed a rigid, orderly line. Roxy remained seated beside me, glaring at the others as if daring them to rush me. She had claimed her spot, and in the unspoken hierarchy of the 404th, the rest of them respected it. I picked up my magnetic driver, looking at the mountain of broken, scorched, and jammed weaponry piled on my desk. I was exhausted. I was bleeding. I was stuck on the most dangerous planet in the sector, with a blood cadre of giant, aggressive matriarchs. But as I popped the seal on Roxy's kinetic hammer and got to work, a cynical smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. Command had tried to throw me away. Instead, they had accidentally made me the most valuable man in the battalion. Time in Sector 7 didn't pass in days or weeks. It passed in repair tickets, artillery barrages, and empty thermal cells. By my 3rd week with the 404th, the bureaucratic countdown of 6 to 8 weeks had dissolved into a meaningless joke. Jenkins, the desk jockey at administration, hadn't sent a single update regarding my transfer. I stopped asking. I stopped caring. The war didn't care about paperwork, and neither did the mud. My corner of the barracks had evolved. It was no longer just a rigid bunk and a shared iron table. The Kylari had collectively, and without asking my permission, built a fortress of scrap metal, stacked ammunition crates, and scavenged armor plating around my workspace. They called it blast shielding. I called it a cage. But it kept the drafting wind out, and more importantly, it established a physical boundary. My turf. I sat on my stool, a magnifying loop wedged into my right eye, meticulously rethreading the microscopic focal wires of a sniper optic. My hands were stained a permanent, bruised purple from the synthetic grease the Kylari used on their heavy kinetics. I had calluses on top of my calluses. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours straight since I arrived, but a strange, terrifying calm had settled into my bones. "You are squinting again. Your optical organs are failing." I didn't look up. Roxy was leaning against the entrance to my makeshift fortress. She spent most of her downtime here now. She had appointed herself my unofficial handler, a role she took with lethal seriousness. Twice in the last 10 days, I had seen her physically shoulder other Kalari out of the way when they tried to bypass the repair queue. "My eyes are fine," I muttered, snipping a frayed copper lead with my tweezers. "The lighting in this bunker was designed for giants with night vision. I'm working in the dark." Roxy grunted. A second later, a heavy, portable floodlight slammed onto the table, blinding me with a harsh white beam. I blinked furiously, shoving the loop up onto my forehead. "Better?" she asked. The translator delivered the word flatly, but the slight tilt of her head betrayed a smug satisfaction. "Yeah, thanks," I said, rubbing the spots from my vision. I set the optic down and picked up a rag, wiping the grease from my knuckles. I looked at her. She was out of her heavy armor, wearing only the dark gray combat fatigues that clung to her massive corded muscles. The jagged scar on her jaw caught the harsh light. She reached into a thigh pouch and tossed a sealed foil packet onto the table. It landed with a heavy, dense thud. "Eat!" Roxy commanded. I picked it up. It was a standard Kalari field ration. High-density protein, heavily spiced to mask the taste of whatever cloned meat they mashed into it. It tasted like ash and chili powder, but it had twice the caloric value of my human rations. "I have my own supply," I protested weakly. "Your supply is dust and sugar," Roxy replied, crossing her massive arms. She stepped further into my enclave, ducking slightly to avoid a hanging power cable. "You have lost mass. 3 kilograms since your arrival. Your combat harness hangs loose. A heavy gust of wind on the staging ground will snap your spine." "I weigh 170 pounds, Roxy. I'm not going to blow away." "You are frail," she insisted, tapping a thick, clawed finger against my shoulder. The physical contact was casual, but the force behind it nearly tipped me off the stool. "And you are mine to protect. Eat the protein." I didn't argue. Arguing with a 7-foot-tall apex predator about my dietary habits was a losing battle. I tore the foil open with my teeth and forced a mouthful down. It burned all the way to my stomach. A heavy silence settled between us, broken only by the distant, muffled thud of artillery landing miles outside the wire. Roxy watched me eat. Her amber eyes were intense, analyzing my every movement. "On my homeworld," she said suddenly, her voice dropping to a low, rumbling hum, "males do not bleed. They do not hold weapons. They are kept in the deep stone cities, far from the sky. They are soft. They sing. They create art." I chewed the dry protein paste, washing it down with a swig from my canteen. "Sounds boring," Roxy frowned, a complex shifting of the dermal plates around her brow. "It is safe. Safety is a privilege our blood cadres bleed to provide. Yet you are here, a male, in the mud, fixing machines of death. Does your species not value you?" I leaned back against the concrete wall. I thought about the drafting boards back on Earth. The desperate propaganda posters plastered across every transit station. The harsh, grinding reality of a war of attrition against an enemy that didn't take prisoners. "My species doesn't have the luxury of keeping men behind walls," I said quietly. "Humans aren't as strong as Kalari. We aren't as fast. We don't have natural armor. If we want to survive in this galaxy, everyone fights. Men, women. Doesn't matter. You hold a gun, or you fix the gun, or you die. Roxy stepped closer. She reached out, her massive four-fingered hand gently tracing the edge of my grease-stained cheek. Her touch was surprisingly delicate, a stark contrast to the violence I knew she was capable of. "You do not hold a gun," she murmured, "but you are not soft." Before I could process the weight of that statement, the bunker's proximity klaxon screamed. It wasn't the oscillating wail of indirect fire. It was the frantic, high-pitched shriek of a perimeter breach. The red tactical lights flickered, died, and then flared back to life. The ground shook so violently my stool tipped over. Harper's voice detonated over the internal comms. "All hands! Sector 7 is compromised! Heavy armor on the wire! Move! Move! Move!" Roxy's hand snapped away from my face. The quiet contemplation vanished instantly, replaced by cold, hard murder. She snatched her heavy plasma caster off the rack. "Grab your tools, little mechanic," she snarled, racking the heavy bolt. Our break is over. The rain had turned into a freezing deluge, cutting through the toxic yellow smoke that blanketed Fob Delta. The trench line was a slaughterhouse. I scrambled on my hands and knees through the freezing mud, dragging my waterproof tool bag behind me. The noise was apocalyptic. The deafening roar of Kalari plasma fire was drowning under a new, terrifying sound. The deep, mechanical grinding of Ripper Siege engines. "They breached the outer berm!" Quinn roared over the squad comms. She was 20 yards ahead of me, firing her kinetic hammer in rapid, punishing bursts. The air distorted around the weapon's muzzle as localized gravity fields slammed into the advancing horde, crushing Bone and Keaton. I stayed low, sliding into a crater just behind Roxy's position. The mud here was warm, mixed with acidic blood and the smoking remnants of a barricade. I peeked over the rim of the crater. My stomach instantly seized. It wasn't just a swarm of infantry this time. The Rippers had brought a Goliath. It was a massive, six-legged biomechanical nightmare, heavily plated with scavenged coalition tank armor. It stood 20 feet high, crushing the razor wire beneath its massive spiked treads. A heavy acid cannon was mounted to its back, spewing streams of violently corrosive green liquid onto the defensive line. Wherever the acid hit, concrete hissed and melted into toxic slag. "Concentrate fire on the central mass," Harper's voice echoed down the trench line. She was standing fully exposed on a blasted berm, emptying a heavy repeater rifle into the beast. The plasma bolts washed over the Goliath's scavenged armor, scoring the metal but failing to penetrate. Roxy stood up, bracing her Mark IV caster against the lip of the trench. She unleashed a sustained, blinding beam of superheated plasma. The beam struck the Goliath's front leg joint. The metal glowed cherry red, but the beast barely flinched. It turned its massive multi-eyed sensor cluster toward Roxy's position. "It's not piercing!" Roxy yelled over the din, dropping back into the trench just as a torrent of green acid washed over the spot she had been occupying. The concrete above us sizzled and popped, raining hot, toxic droplets onto our armor. "Their heat sinks are failing," Quinn shouted, sliding into the crater next to us. Her kinetic hammer was completely dead, the safety vents blowing white steam into the freezing rain. "Our standard yield is useless against that plating." I stared at the Goliath. It was lumbering forward, preparing to step directly over our trench line. If it got behind us, the entire FOB would be flanked and slaughtered. I looked at the heavy plasma casters in the hands of the 404th. They were built for sustained firefights, throttled by heavy magnetic regulators to prevent the volatile plasma cores from going critical. It was a safety measure. "Give me your gun," I said, my voice cracking. Roxy snapped her head toward me. "What?" "Give me the damn gun, Roxy!" I screamed, the panic and adrenaline overriding any sense of self-preservation. I lunged forward, grabbing the heavy casing of her Mark IV. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then released her grip. I dropped the massive weapon into the mud and frantically unzipped my tool bag. I didn't bother with the magnetic driver. I grabbed a heavy pry bar and jammed it directly into the primary heatsink assembly housing. "Miller, what are you doing?" Harper barked over the local channel, having fallen back to our position. "I'm stripping the magnetic regulator," I said, putting my boot against the weapon's barrel and hauling back on the pry bar. With a sickening crack of expensive alien metal, the side plate snapped off, exposing the glowing blue, pulsing plasma core. "Are you insane?" Quinn yelled, stepping back. "If you bypass the regulator, the containment field will collapse. It will detonate." "Not immediately," I yelled back, my fingers flying over the delicate, exposed wiring. I grabbed my wire cutters and snipped the thick red tether connecting the fail-safe logic board to the firing pin. Without the regulator, the weapon draws directly from the core's maximum yield. It won't fire a burst. It'll fire the entire battery in one shot. A shaped charge, Roxy realized, her amber eyes widening. "A very, very unstable shaped charge," I corrected, pulling a roll of conductive tape from my belt. I rapidly spliced the firing mechanism directly to the manual trigger, bypassing the internal computer entirely. The weapon immediately began to whine, a high-pitched, teeth-aching frequency that meant the core was heavily destabilizing. The heat radiating off the gun was intense, singing the hairs on my forearms through my fatigue sleeves. The blue glow turned a harsh, angry violet. "It's going to melt the barrel in about 20 seconds, I shouted, my hands shaking violently as I shoved the heavy weapon back into Roxy's hands. "You get one shot. You have to hit it dead center in the main chassis. And you have to brace yourself. The recoil is going to be ungodly." Roxy didn't flinch. She took the vibrating, overloading weapon. She looked at the violent purple light bleeding from the cracked chassis, then looked at me. "Get in the mud, Caleb," she ordered. I threw myself flat against the bottom of the crater, burying my face in my hands. Above me, Roxy stood tall. The Goliath was right on top of us, its massive mechanical legs raising up to crush the trench. Through the roaring chaos, I heard Roxy roar. A deep, primal battle cry that rattled the muddy walls. She pulled the trigger. The sound wasn't a boom. It was a concussive tear in reality. The shockwave hit me like a physical wall, driving the breath from my lungs and flattening me into the dirt. A blinding flash of violet light penetrated straight through my tightly shut eyelids, followed instantly by a wave of searing, blistering heat. Then, an explosion so loud it rendered me completely deaf. Heavy chunks of burning metal rained down from the sky, thudding into the mud around us. I couldn't hear them land. I could only feel the vibrations. I lay there for what felt like hours, coughing on the thick smell of ozone and vaporized steel. Slowly, agonizingly, the ringing in my ears faded into a dull, throbbing whine. I rolled onto my back. The sky above our trench was clear. The Goliath was gone. In its place was a smoking, slagged crater, 20 yards wide. The beast's upper torso had been entirely atomized, its heavy armored legs standing aimlessly in the muck like broken pillars. I looked over. Roxy was sitting in the mud, her back against the crater wall. The Mark IV plasma caster was a melted, bubbling lump of twisted metal fused to the dirt. Roxy's right shoulder plate was cracked entirely in half from the recoil, and her arm hung limp at her side. She looked at the melted gun, then slowly turned her head to look at me. Her amber eyes were wide, the combat adrenaline giving way to raw shock. A slow, jagged grin spread across her face. "Little mechanic," she rasped, her voice thick and breathless. "You build an excellent bomb." Ash fell like dirty snow across Sector 7, coating the slagged remains of the Ripper siege engine in a pale gray film. I pushed myself up onto my knees. The mud beneath me was warm, baked by the sheer thermal radiation of the overloaded plasma core. My ears were still ringing, a high, thin whine that made my teeth ache. I looked over at Roxy. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting against the crater wall, her right arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Her breathing was heavy, rattling against her scorched chest plates. I scrambled over to her, slipping twice in the muck. "Hey," I rasped, my throat raw from smoke and screaming. "Let me see." I didn't wait for permission. I reached out and unlatched the shattered remnants of her right pauldron. The metal was still hot to the touch. Beneath the armor, her dark gray skin was heavily bruised, the shoulder joint clearly dislocated. Kailari physiology was incredibly dense, but physics always collected its toll. "Do not touch the joint," Roxy grunted, her amber eyes snapping to mine. Pain flared in her expression, quickly buried under layers of stubborn pride. "I will reset it myself. Just give me a moment to cycle my pain receptors." "Don't be an idiot," I said, sliding my arm under her good shoulder. "You're going to pass out if you do it in the mud. Come on, up." I braced my boots against the crater floor and hauled upward. It was like trying to deadlift a small car. Roxy groaned, a deep, rumbling vibration, and used her remaining leverage to push herself to her feet. She swayed, a 7-foot giant leaning heavily against a 170-pound human. I locked my knees to keep us both from collapsing back into the dirt. "I have you," I muttered, gritting my teeth. "I am crushing you, Caleb," she pointed out, though she didn't pull away. "I'll live." We climbed out of the crater together. The firefight had broken along the rest of the perimeter. With their Goliath destroyed, the remaining Ripper forces had fractured and retreated into the toxic fog. Sector 7 had held. Harper was waiting for us at the edge of the trench line. She stood tall, her armor painted in alien blood, a heavy repeater rifle resting easily on her shoulder. She looked at Roxy's shattered arm, then down at the melted puddle of metal that used to be a Mark IV plasma caster. Finally, her eyes settled on me. "A manual core overload," Harper said, her voice devoid of its usual aggressive edge. It was clinical, thoughtful. "You turned a standard infantry weapon into a tactical strike. You could have vaporized yourselves." "We were going to get crushed anyway," I replied, panting under Roxy's weight. "I just changed the math." Harper stepped forward, reaching out to take Roxy's weight from me. I instantly felt lighter, though my spine still throbbed in protest. Harper supported her second-in-command effortlessly. "Get to the bunker, Miller," Harper ordered. "Medical is setting up triage." I nodded, trudging behind them as we made our way back to the reinforced concrete dome. The inside of the barracks was a mess of exhausted, bleeding warriors. Med droids hovered over bunks, sealing cuts and administering stimulants. My workbench, my makeshift fortress, had survived entirely untouched. I collapsed onto my stool, resting my head against the cold steel of the table. I just wanted to sleep. I wanted to close my eyes and forget the smell of burning chitin and vaporized metal. My combat harness buzzed. A sharp, annoying chirp cut through the low groans of the wounded. I fumbled for my datapad, wiping a layer of grease off the screen. It was a direct comms link. I tapped accept. "Miller?" Jenkins's voice crackled through the tiny speaker. He sounded bored. Same old Jenkins, utterly insulated from the slaughter just a few miles away. "You alive over there?" "I'm breathing, Jenkins," I said, my voice hollow. "What do you want?" "Good news. Command finally processed your appeal. The bureaucracy is a nightmare, but we got it sorted." Keys clacked in the background. "They admitted the clerical error. You're being officially reassigned to the 404th Logistics and Auxiliary, Supply Depot 9, safe behind the secondary lines. A transport crawler is hitting Sector 7 in 20 minutes to pick you up. Pack your gear." I stared at the screen. Logistics, safe lines, no artillery, no mud, no multi-limbed scavengers trying to rip my face off. It was everything I had begged for 3 weeks ago. It was a golden ticket out of hell. I looked up. Roxy was sitting on the bunk opposite my workbench. A med droid was working on her shoulder, but she had waved off the sedatives. She was watching me. Harper stood beside her, her arms crossed, listening. They had both heard the comms link. Every Kylari within 20 feet had heard it. The barracks went completely silent. The ambient chatter, the hum of the droids, everything stopped. 80 pairs of glowing amber eyes slowly turned toward my corner of the room. "Supply Depot 9, Roxy repeated softly. The translator struggled with the wet, gravelly texture of her voice. "Safe." I looked at the pile of broken gear on my desk. I looked at the blast shielding they had built for me. I looked at Roxy, who had literally thrown herself between me and an alien blade, and Harper, who had finally stopped looking at me like a fragile mistake. In logistics, I would be another anonymous mechanic tightening bolts on shipping crates. I would be safe. I would be entirely replaceable. Here, I was the only thing standing between a blood cadre and empty weapons. I wasn't just a man in a cage anymore. I was their pulse. I keyed the microphone on the datapad. "Cancel the transfer, Jenkins." A long pause on the other end. "Say again, Miller. You've got a ticket out. The crawler is already en route." "Tell the crawler to turn around," I said, my voice hardening. I sat up straight, ignoring the ache in my ribs. "I'm not leaving Sector 7. My assignment stands. 404th Embedded Support." "You're crazy," Jenkins sighed. "If you reject this, system locks you in for the duration of the campaign. There are no more appeals." "I don't need one." Miller out. I killed the connection and tossed the datapad onto the desk. The silence in the barracks held for another heartbeat. Then Roxy grinned. It was a terrifying, jagged expression that showed entirely too many sharp teeth. She slammed her good hand against the metal frame of her bunk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Harper uncrossed her arms. She didn't smile, but she gave me that same slow, deliberate nod. "Good," Harper stated, turning back to the room. "Squad 3, get your optics to the mechanic. We drop again in 6 hours, and I want those lenses pristine." The chaotic hum of the barracks instantly resumed. The Kailari went back to their gear, their voices a little louder, a little more energetic. I pulled my tool roll toward me, picking up my magnetic driver. I was exhausted, bruised, and officially trapped on the worst front of the Orion campaign. But as Roxy walked over, ignoring the med droid, and dropped a fresh, steaming ration packet onto my table, I knew I had made the right choice. They were giant, aggressive, and utterly terrifying. But they were my monsters now, and I had work to do.